We've got a full agenda for the next couple of days, so we're going to get started on time so that we can try to keep on time throughout the day and tomorrow. And I want to thank everyone for coming. Thank our committee for their time in advance, because this is an awful lot of work and a lot of things to cover for them. And I want to also thank our staff, which has been working diligently to get prepared for all of this. And we'll start with introductions first of the staff. We'll start on my left here. We've got our revisors, Jason Long and Mike Heim are here this morning. We've got, I know Travis Rose, he's not sitting here right now, and Robin Crumpton, our IT people. Robin, wave your hand there. Connie Bonner is our committee assistant. And then from our research department, we've got Elaine Rudder and also Leanne Thone, and they've been working very hard to get ready for this. Committee, I'll let you go ahead and introduce yourself, starting with my vice chair on the left, and we'll just go around. And some of the other folks are a little bit slow getting here, but they can catch up.
Well, good morning, everybody. Representative Pat Proctor. I serve the people of Leavenworth and Fort Leavenworth, and I'm also the chair of the House Committee on Elections.
Good morning. My name is Cindy Howerton. I represent South Wichita, North Hayesville, and a little bit of Derby.
I'm Senator Tim Schallenberg. I represent Cherokee, Crawford, and Bourbon County.
Senator Mike Peterson represents South Wichita and parts of the Derby area.
Yeah, Representative Mike Dodson. I represent Riley County and Manhattan. Good to be here today, and thanks for coming.
And I'm Senator Mike Thompson from the 10th District. That's Shawnee, Lake Quivira, Merriam, Overland Park, and next year we'll add some of Lenexa. Senator Rick Cluse said he'd be running about 10 minutes behind. We also have Representative Paul Wagner, Representative Tom Sawyer, Senator Olathe Faust-Godot, and Representative Brandon Woodard. And some may be online. I'm not 100% sure about that yet, but hopefully they'll get here pretty shortly so they can hear all the testimony. We are a paperless committee to some extent. We do for committee members who need or may have forgotten to bring their laptop. We will have some paper copies, have some available for you if you like them. Let Leanne know and she'll get those to you. For all of those who are watching in the audience, watching online, all of the testimony is available online. The easiest way for you to get there is go to our legislature website, which is ks.legislature.org. Across the top, there's a kind of a bluish banner that starts with House and Senate and legislators, and go to the committees tab. Underneath the committees tab, there is a selection for special and select. You click on that, and it will take you to this Special Committee on Elections website. And the committee, I think it's under Agenda and Minutes, all the testimony is there. We have not only the conferees who will be here in person, but we've accepted written testimony from a number of people over the course of the last few days. And so all of that testimony that's available to us has been uploaded so that everybody can review that information. And I do want to just open by saying, you know, elections are kind of an emotional topic. Over the recent days, if you're like the rest of this committee, I'm sure I've received a lot of emotional emails from people regarding what may or may not be said in this committee based on something they read or heard in a report before a word of testimony has been entered into the record. And I just want to make note that, you know, fair and secure elections are vital to the survival of a constitutional republic. And for years, Kansas has been a leader in election integrity and election law to ensure that our processes are secure as possible. But to continue to lead in this arena requires vigilance. And we don't want to be a train wreck on national TV like some other states have. So we must continue to examine our process. Kind of the way I look at this is when the Kansas City Chiefs won the Super Bowl, they didn't stop evaluating the salary cap or players or coaches. And if they want to continue to dominate the league, they must always be looking for ways to improve. And that's what we're doing here. As a winning team, you have to look to ways to continue to improve on what you've done. So the goal of this committee today and tomorrow is to review what we've accomplished, assess the implementation of current statutes, and determine other issues that need to be addressed so we can evaluate where to go from here. So that's basically the charge of the committee over the next 2 days. Also, a reminder, committee, turn in your vouchers to me, and we'll get those taken care of. So to get started this morning, I want to turn it first over to Leanne Thone, who's our research analyst from the Kansas Legislative Research Department, to give us an overview of some recent Kansas statutes on elections. Leanne?
Good morning. As he said, my name is Leanne Thone. I'm with KLRD. Good to see you all this morning. So in the testimony, you have a memo from KLRD, and this memo goes over election law going back to 2017, just to give sort of an overview of what we've done in the past several years. We decided to go back to 2017 because that was the year that the 3-day grace period was passed, and that's something that will be discussed over the next couple of days. I'll also note, if you're looking at this testimony online, we've linked the full bill summary to each bill title so that you can go to that if you want. This document with the full summaries was really long, so we tried to sort of condense that down for you to make it a little bit more useful. It's still a little bit long, so this morning I'm going to give you kind of the quick fly through of these bills just to jog your memory of what we've done over the last few years in the state. So in 2017, the legislature passed 3 bills. HB 2017 and SB 43 made some changes regarding filing for congressional vacancies and canvass dates. And HB 2017 in particular changed the number of signatures needed to file an independent candidate nominating petition to fill a congressional vacancy. And HB 2158 was the bill that changed that advanced mail ballot deadline to 3 days after Election Day. That bill also requires notice to be provided 30 days prior to an election if there are changes to the polling place, and it provides an option for write-in candidates to have their name removed from a general election ballot if they so desire. In 2018, the legislature passed 2 election-related bills. This begins on page 3 of that memo. HB 2539 made quite a few changes. Candidacy qualification for statewide offices. You must be an elector of Kansas by the deadline for filing in order to be a candidate. You must be age 25 to run for governor, lieutenant governor, and you must be licensed to practice law in Kansas to run for AG. Signature verification is not required for voters with disabilities who are unable to sign their own name. Voters with disabilities may also request assistance with signing. The Secretary of State is to prescribe the format for advanced ballot voting envelopes. This bill also put in the requirement for election audits, for a manual audit in 1% of all precincts, a minimum of 1 precinct, selected randomly. The canvass may be moved to any business day no later than 13 days after an election under this bill. It also requires any electronic or electromechanical voting system to provide a paper record of each vote cast and have the ability to be tested before the election and prior to the canvass date. HB 2642, also in 2018, required the Secretary of State's office to publish precinct-level primary and general election results for certain offices no later than 30 days after the final canvass. 2019, 2 bills were passed by the legislature. This is starting on page 4. Sub for SB 130 requires county election officers to attempt to contact voters who submit an advanced voting ballot without a signature or with a signature that does not match the one on file. Voters in a county can vote at any polling place within that county on an election day. And it also changed some filing deadlines and other things at the township and school board level. We also had SCR 1605. This was an amendment to the Kansas Constitution. This was regarding reapportionment of senatorial and representative districts to remove the census adjustment for military personnel and students, and that was approved by voters at 60% voting yes. Then we skipped to 2021. There were no bills relating to elections in 2020. There were few bills that year at all. So we'll go to 2021. Senate sub for HB 2183. This made several changes to advance mail ballot policies. It made it to unlawful to backdate or alter a postmark on an advance mail ballot. It requires signature verification for advance mail ballots, removes the authority of the Secretary of State to extend the deadline for receiving advance mail ballots, and creates the crime of falsely representing an election official. The Secretary of State must also report the number of registered voters in each county and political party on a monthly basis, and the number of registered voters in each precinct and party 10 days prior to an election. This also made delivering ballots for another person prohibited without a written statement signed by the voter and the person delivering, and it restricted that ballot delivery to no more than 10 ballots during an election. This bill also expanded the definition of electioneering. HB 2332 requires each county office to maintain residential and mailing addresses for each voter if those are different. They require soliciting by mail a registered voter to file an application for, or it made requirements for soliciting by mail a registered voter to file an application for an advance voting ballot. This also made some prohibitions of alterations of election laws by the governor, executive branch, or judicial branch, and expands the crime of election tampering. In 2022, there were two bills. This is starting on page 9 of the memo. Senate sub for HB 2138. This created the affidavit system for tracking ballots, created the requirement for a biennial elections audit to be held following the general election of an even-numbered year, created requirements for ballots to have watermarks, created exemptions for certain election crimes by poll workers to help exempt them doing their job. Required confirmation notices for inactive voters, and allows county election officials to remove a voter from the rolls if they've had no election-related activity for 4 years, including things like signing a petition. Exemptions from the crime of electioneering for certain candidates. This also implemented audits for elections that are within 1%. This also required canvass abstracts to be available for review by any authorized poll agent. County election officers must provide precinct-level election results electronically in machine-readable format no later than 30 days after the canvass. 2138 also made requirements for electronic poll books, electronic or electromechanical voting systems, and requires public notice of testing of vote tabulation and optical scanning equipment to be published on the county website if possible, if they have a website. Repeat testing must be conducted within 5 business days of the completion of the canvass. And then the last bill in 2022 was Senate sub for HB 2252, and this was the bill that prohibits modifying election laws by agreement. That brings us to 2023, so these probably feel pretty familiar. That starts on page 12. There were 3 bills. SB 221 was the pretty long bill that was brought by the Secretary of State, which makes some changes to the deadline to submit affidavits for writing candidacy, clarifications regarding election administration for the Secretary of State and county election officers, adjustments of election-related dates and deadlines, and some other changes. Senate sub for HB 2053 was the presidential preference primary bill, which allows the parties to have a presidential preference primary in March of 2024. And then HB 2087, which is regarding selection of presidential electors. So that is kind of the high-level overview. Again, you have the memo, and then you can find those links to the full-length bill summaries if you're interested in more detail on those. I will also note that we have a KLRD memo that is a late addition to testimony. Just got approval to add that to our body of testimony. And it is just including a lot of research that we had been asked to compile in preparation for this committee. So there's information on advanced voting ballots, deadlines, the 3-day grace period, voting machines, drop boxes, lots of different topics that we'll be talking about over the next couple of days. And that includes some information that we received from the Secretary of State and the Kansas County Clerks and Election Officials Association that I think would be useful. So that will be included in the testimony shortly if it's not already on the website. And if I've given you paper copies, I will give you a paper copy of that tomorrow. So I'm happy to take questions if anybody has any.
Yeah, and I think that was just uploaded, the one you just
Yes.
referenced. So committee, I don't see it up there yet. But,
Okay.
I'm looking at the S drive.
It's in the late additions folder.
Oh, is that where it's at?
In the
Okay.
S drive. I did that to help our committee assistant know what has been added since
Is it called memo?
Yes.
Special okay, I see
the
it.
advanced
So
voting.
committee, if you do have your laptop, it's in the S drive in the late additions folders as memo special committee elections from
Yes.
Leanne Thone. Okay, committee, any questions over the overview of recent election law? Seeing none, thank you, Leanne. Obviously, we'll want to reference back to that if we have any questions from our Secretary of State's office or whomever. Next up, we're going to go to Jason Long from the Office of Revisor of Statutes to give us a review of the litigation status of changed election laws, anything that may be still in the courts or in process. Jason?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Jason Long with the Office of Revisor of Statutes. You have in your packet of information a memo from our office on the litigation status of election law changes that were challenged. Specifically, there were 5 provisions challenged after the 2021 session. So these are referring back to those bills that were passed that Ms. Thon reviewed with you. Specifically, House Bill 2183 came out in 2021, had 3 provisions that were all challenged in state district court here in Shawnee County. That was the provision that created the crime of false representation of an election official. It's now KSA 25-2438. The requirement that county election officials verify the signature match on an advanced voting ballot in order for it to be counted. And then the restrictions on delivery of advanced voting ballots on behalf of other voters, restricting that to 10. Those 3 provisions were all challenged in state district court. In addition to that, there were 2 provisions of House Bill 2332 that were challenged in federal district court. So we jump into the federal court for those 2 provisions, and those were 2 provisions regarding advanced voting ballot applications. The first prohibited entities that were sending these applications. These aren't the advanced voting ballots. Those come from the county election office, but the application itself could be sent out by a third-party organization to voters, and the first provision prohibited them from filling out any of the information on the application in advance of sending it to the voter. So they had, under the law, to send a blank application for an advanced voting ballot to the voter. The second provision that was challenged was a provision that restricted parties outside of the state of Kansas from sending in those applications to Kansas voters. You had to be a resident, or your entity, your organization had to be domiciled in the state of Kansas to be able to send those applications to Kansas voters under that second provision. So those were the 2 that were challenged in federal court. I'll briefly go through each of these challenges and give you an update on where we stand in the court system. The first one is in the state district court. In that lawsuit, there was a challenge against the false representation of election official. Plaintiffs are arguing that there were potential state constitutional violations against their rights of freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Also, there was a potential for overbreadth of being prosecuted for committing acts that wouldn't constitute criminal acts under that law. The trial court denied the plaintiff's motion for a temporary injunction to try and enjoin and stop enforcement of that law. The plaintiffs appealed to the Kansas Court of Appeals, and in June of 2022, the Kansas Court of Appeals held the plaintiffs had no standing to bring any challenge to that law under what they had argued in their pleading. And so the Kansas Court of Appeals dismissed that claim altogether. The plaintiffs have appealed that intermediate appellate decision to the Kansas Supreme Court, and the Kansas Supreme Court has granted that request to review that decision on appeal, and that's where that claim stands. So right now, the law that makes it a crime to be falsely represent oneself as an election official is still invalid. It's in full force and effect in the state of Kansas, and there's an appeal pending in the Kansas State Supreme Court on that challenge. The other two that were brought in the state trial court kind of followed a similar path. The first was the requirement for a signature match on advanced voting ballots. The plaintiffs again challenged that lawsuit under a variety of state constitutional violations. In April of 2022, the trial court dismissed the plaintiff's claim for failure to state a claim, ruled that under a rational basis standard, the plaintiffs had failed to meet their burden to establish they had any legal claim to challenge that provision. The plaintiffs appealed that decision, and in March of 2023, about 6 months ago, the Kansas Court of Appeals reversed the lower court, the trial court, in that finding. The Court of Appeals held that the statute potentially, because the ability to count the votes was determined by whether or not there was a signature match, there was the potential infringement on a voter's right to vote. Therefore, and that right to vote is a fundamental right under the Kansas Constitution, and therefore, if any law is potentially going to infringe upon that right to vote, the strict scrutiny standard should be applied, not the lower rational basis standard. And so the Court of Appeals sent the case back to the lower court to conduct further proceedings, and in those proceedings, the state would have to demonstrate that, one, it had a compelling interest in passing that law, and two, the law is narrowly tailored to further that compelling interest. That's the two-pronged standard to get over that strict scrutiny burden that is now on the state to show that the law is constitutional. The state has filed an appeal from that decision to the Kansas Supreme Court, and that appeal was request was granted. So that decision is also now sitting at the state Supreme Court to be heard and decided upon by the state Supreme Court. Likewise, the third challenge in the state court on the 10 ballot restriction on delivery of advanced voting ballots on behalf of other voters followed a similar path. It was also dismissed for failure to state a claim by the trial court. It was also, that decision was also reversed by the Kansas Court of Appeals in their March 2023 decision along the same grounds, finding that it was potential infringement on the right to vote. Right to vote is a fundamental right, therefore strict scrutiny should have been the applicable standard. There was a remand back to the trial court. Again, the state appealed the Court of Appeals decision, and so all three challenges from that state court lawsuit are now sitting at the Kansas Supreme Court waiting for hearings and a review and decision from the state Supreme Court on those. All three of those laws are still in full force and effect. There are no temporary or permanent injunctions against any of those laws, so they are still being carried forward and enforced under the law. The last two provisions, as I said, were brought in federal district court. These were provisions under House Bill 2332, requiring that applications for advanced voting ballots can't be pre-completed before being sent to the voter, and that the organizations, individuals sending out those applications had to be residents of Kansas. That was filed also in June 2021. In December of 2021, the federal district court issued a preliminary order denying the state's motion to dismiss and granting the plaintiff's request for a temporary injunction. So there was an injunction placed against both of those provisions, preventing them from being enforced as of December 21. A couple months later, in February of 22, the parties agreed that the out-of-state prohibition was a violation of plaintiff's constitutional rights, and the court then issued a permanent injunction against that provision. So that provision has been permanently enjoined. So you can be an out-of-state entity, out-of-state party, and send advanced voting ballot applications to Kansas registered voters. A trial was subsequently conducted on the remaining provision, which is the personalized advanced voting ballot application restriction. And then just this last May, the federal district court issued its ruling in that challenge and held that prohibiting personalizing advanced voting ballot applications was a violation of the plaintiff's constitutional rights of speech and association. Because it potentially infringed on their First Amendment rights, it was subject to strict scrutiny. The state had failed to satisfy that burden of a compelling interest, and that the law was narrowly tailored to that interest. Additionally, the court held the statute was unconstitutionally overbroad, as it criminalized a substantial amount of protected speech and wasn't just limited to only legitimate purposes. And the court ultimately issued a permanent injunction against that provision as well. I will say the state has appealed that decision up to the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals through the federal system, but at this time, both of those provisions are enjoined and are not being enforced at this time. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Jason. Very comprehensive. Any questions from the committee? I do have, so if these fail, for example, with the matching signatures, then we would not be able to require matching signatures to validate a voter's ID?
I think the issue is hinging counting the vote on the matching signature requirement as it was enacted in the 2021 legislation, because there is language up above that talks about the voter signatures, being a match. But in 2021, the legislature enacted a separate provision that required an additional process of matching those signatures and then not counting the vote if those signatures didn't match. And so I think it's that later provision that would be permanently enjoined if the court finds that the state hasn't met its burden on strict scrutiny under those rulings.
And then the other question I have, Jason, is regarding the filling out of the advanced ballot applications. In Johnson County here recently, in recent weeks, there was a mass mailing of advanced voting applications from the election official there. And I know this is being, held up in court right now. Would that law being passed, even though it's held up in the courts, not provide some legislative intent of that law that an election official would want to consider before doing something like that?
Well, I will point out that law was targeting the non-election official entities, the third-party organizations that send applications to registered voters. I believe that law has an exemption for the Secretary of State's office, and county election officials aren't subject to that. I'm not sure if that's their practice to personalize applications or if their practice is just to send out blank applications. I would defer to the Secretary of State's office on that question, but I believe they're exempted from that. This is just directed at those non-Kansas entities sending applications to Kansas registered voters, and they're in the practice of filling out like the voter's name and address and potentially even precinct where they would, turn in their ballot for them before they send the application to the voter to then sign and mail into the county election office.
Okay, and we can ask the Secretary of State's office when they get up here to testify after a bit. Vice Chair Proctor had a question.
Yeah, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I remember that another provision of that same statute was that if the ballot application was being sent by a non-governmental agency, they had to put on the application in a certain font that this wasn't from a government entity. Has that been enjoined, or is that still in force?
No, that is still in full force and effect. That particular paragraph of those provisions was not subject to the lawsuit. Only the personalized completion of the application and the out-of-state residency requirement. Those were the only two provisions that were challenged in that lawsuit.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any other questions? Representative Wagner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jason, so what exactly is the status on signature verification? I mean, an automatic rejection apparently has been enjoined at this point, but is there no standard on signature verification at this point, or it goes back to an older standard? Can you kind of clarify that for me?
So currently, because the signature match was part of the state court decision and there was no injunction issued by the trial court on that provision, the trial court had originally just dismissed the plaintiff's claims. The Court of Appeals had reversed that decision and said, no, you've got to consider the plaintiff's claims under the strict scrutiny standard. But then the state appealed to the state Supreme Court that decision. So we're sitting on appeal at the state Supreme Court without any injunction in place. So the signature matching requirement is still in full force and effect. If the state Supreme Court agrees with the Intermediate Court of Appeals and the case is sent back to the trial court and the state can't meet that strict scrutiny standard, then there's a likelihood that the statute would be enjoined at that point. At that point, then we would fall back to that earlier provision that was in law prior to 2021, where the signature has to match, but we don't have this more specific requirement that the county election official go through these processes to match that or discount the vote, not count the vote.
Okay, I follow that. Thank you.
Any other questions? Senator Faust-Godot, and welcome here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I forgot about the traffic
Oh,
on the highway, the construction from Wichita. So, Jason, does this also consider those with disabilities, that their signature changes over time? I mean,
right now, the signature match does have some language, I think, accounting for disabilities. I believe the Secretary of State's office has adopted some regulations or guidance to that effect. Again, I would defer to Mr. Barker to maybe fill in the committee more on those details as to what the counties are actually doing in practice on that signature match. But currently, it is still in force and effect pending a decision from the state Supreme Court.
Any other last-minute questions? Seeing none, thank you, Jason. We appreciate that very much. Our next conferees are going to talk about agency involvement in voter registration and legal issues. And we'd like to welcome Madeline Melissa, who's a visiting fellow from Opportunity Solutions Project, and Stuart Wilson, also from Opportunity Solutions Project. And Travis will, I think we've got their PowerPoint up. Welcome to Kansas, and we appreciate you being here, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair Thompson, Vice Chair Proctor, and honorable members of this committee. Good morning. My name is Madeline, and this is my colleague, Stuart, and we are visiting fellows at the Opportunity Solutions Project. OSP is a nonprofit, nonpartisan advocacy organization, and we work in more than 40 states across the country with one clear goal: to help more people achieve the American dream, and we appreciate the opportunity to speak before your committee today. The U.S. Constitution